Hey, y'all. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for sticking with us for so far. And a very hearty thanks to the three fabulous panels who have already presented. I always learn so much from y'all, and that's something for which I'm truly grateful. I would also like to know before I start that this presentation represents investigative journey that's very much in progress. So I would love nothing more for this to be the launching pad to, rather than the end to, further conversations and questions and discussions. Right. All objects ask questions, but some might find voiced theirs louder and more forcefully than others. When I first met my object over here, the question that it screamed at me was, "What on earth is it?" MESDA's catalog suggests that it was a cabinet made in Baltimore. The neoclassical aesthetic of the object's glazed doors, mahogany veneer, and French feet suggests that it was made around probably 1790 to 1810. There's very little evidence of how it was actually used, although its ornaments, size, and similarity with Sheraton's ladies' cabinet, as you see on the right here, certainly suggests female usage, and its pigeonhole systems linked it to writing furniture. Penciled inscriptions, Anna T. Burgess, Orange, VA, on all four of the drawer bottoms linked the object to Anna Taylor Burgess, who lived between 1866 and 1956, over 2 generations after the object was made. And therein you see some of the difficulties of this project. Anna's link to our object led to an attribution that it was first bought by Michael Burgess, Anna's husband's grandfather, who lived in Baltimore. Connoisseurship, however, prompted me to question the object's cataloged identity. Although the object's refined proportions and innovative form led to an automatic Baltimore attribution, its telling use of yellow pine as a secondary wood, more characteristic really of Virginia than Baltimore, raised certain suspicions. The resinous and knotty pine is a very difficult substrate to veneer on, suggesting that it was chosen for local availability rather than for ease for crafting. Entertaining the radical notion that the object actually descended in Anna's own family rather than her husband's led me to discover that she was actually from an old and powerful planter's family, the Taylors, based in Orange, Virginia, in the Piedmont, where yellow pine was abundant and actually abundantly used in craft. Anna's great-grandfather, Robert Taylor, a congressman and kinsman of President James Madison as well as Zachary Taylor, then emerges as a very likely candidate as the purchaser of this object. Taylor inherited Meadow Farm, an Orange, Virginia plantation from his father Erasmus in 1794, which falls within the period of the object's fashionability. Furnishing a new household, Taylor could have purchased this elegant object from Fredericksburg, the local market town, especially if he knew of a very skilled maker over there. Speaking of whom, research into the object's makership further corroborates its link to Robert Taylor. I discovered a group of 3 other highly similar objects, all with the characteristic canted French feet, the somewhat homespun half-fan skirt inlay, construction detail, which I will be very happy to talk about further later on, and unique form. One of these 3 pieces has a provenance linking it to a Fredericksburg maker who emigrated from Philadelphia. Fredericksburg, a thriving town at the turn of the 19th century, was a likely marketplace for the politically ascendant Robert Taylor. A dive in the MESDA craftsman database led me further to John Alcock, a maker who emigrated from Philadelphia to Fredericksburg in 1792 before moving on to Richmond in 1806. This date range further corroborates Taylor's 1794 inheritance of his plantation. While no piece has been firmly attributed to Alcock, making comparisons with his larger corpus somewhat difficult, he consistently advertised, and I quote, fine mahogany veneer furniture and, quote, elegant ladies' writing cabinet in his Fredericksburg shop. His Philadelphia link can certainly explain the object's creative design and relative refinement, traits that have long linked it to Baltimore. And finally, Alcock's father held land in Orange, Virginia, suggesting yet another link to local clients like Robert Taylor. Connoisseurship and genealogy, then, offered an unlikely answer of what this object actually is. Long interpreted as an example of Baltimorean refinement, this object was actually from Fredericksburg, Virginia, made by John Alcock and bought by Robert Taylor between 1792 and 1806. This answer, however, doesn't quite silence, but rather amplifies the object's initial question for me. What is it? What was this object to John Alcock, its maker, or one of its makers? What about Robert Taylor, or others in his household who would have made use of it in some way or another? What about the trees that made up its joints? How are we to consider them? And finally, what does this object mean for those who held it, cleaned it, kept it, but never got to inscribe their mark of ownership on it? Let's first ask, what is this object to the trees whose fragmented bodies made up its material being? Furniture terminology of carcass reminds us that furniture are, first and foremost, dead trunks of once living plants, carved, sliced, and bended to fit human use. The trees, severed from life over 2 centuries ago, still resists imposed human will in visible ways. The left edge of the object, of the top, warps, struggling to go back to its original shape as a tree. The irregularly figured mahogany, especially visible in the skirt over here and in the top band out of view, signals the wood's individuality to the viewer. This further reminds us that this object was born in an age when tree portraits like these proliferated across the Atlantic to celebrate individual trees as idiosyncratic, vital, and even agential entities. The visible ways in which the wood asserts its agency, however, belies how their artificial arrangement also conceal other stories of suppressed violence, where trees, people, and entire ecosystems were destroyed for human greed. By the mid-18th century, mahogany's fantastically figured and reflective surface had become one of the most legible indices of Anglo-American gentility. Yet polite society's demand for the polished beauty of mahogany soon created an ecological disaster in the Caribbean, from which mahogany wood came. While mahogany was once so plentiful in mid-18th century Jamaica, the roughly hewn old-growth trees were used to frame roofs, as you see on the right. By the end of the century, Jamaican mahogany, long regarded as the gold standard of all mahogany species, had been depleted. In the late 18th century, importers at Alexandria and Baltimore, both ports where the mahogany in our object might have come from, advertised for timber from Honduras, and once you get into the 19th century, from Saint-Domingue, but never ever from Jamaica. The wood's disappearance from the import records also reflects its depletion in the forest landscape. The devastation of nature echoed the violent exploitation of human labor as well. Large ancient mahogany, the sort most in demand for its dense grains, figure patterns, and size, did not readily yield to human will. The harvesting of mahogany was a back-breaking job. Enslaved laborers toiled to identify the increasingly few surviving mahogany, loosen the tree's centuries-old hold onto earth and onto life, transported the heavy timber from the interior of the rainforest, dragged across miles of open forest floor, and prepared the huge logs for transoceanic shipping. The beautiful mahogany surfaces that brightened American interiors depended on the exploitative and often life-threatening enslaved labor. Although Alcock likely, to the best of our knowledge anyways, never witnessed firsthand the stripping of the Caribbean landscape, he clearly registered its effects. 2 different grades of mahogany were used in this object. The top band and the skirt that visually bracketed the object feature heavily figured mahogany, whose dreamy, swirling grain engagingly contrasts the geometric emollients. The less visible sides and top, however, featured straight-grained and frankly lower quality veneer. Alcock's strategic material use speaks obliquely to the growing ecological constraint on American performances of gentility as old-growth forests were carved up and devoured. Thinly slicing and applying the veneer on such a small object demanded much skilled labor, but stretched the use value of precious materials. In other words, veneering allowed elegant surfaces to continue to proliferate in American interiors, whilst trees rapidly disappeared in the Caribbean. This fashion for veneering further corresponds with the revival of classicism, an orderly aesthetic that reflected the new American Republic's political aspirations. The knowledge of what lies just beneath the veneered surface, nevertheless, reveals that such performances of gentility and civility were but a veneer that thinly veiled elite American implication in violent systems against humans and landscapes. What does this object mean to its maker, or rather, makers? The textual archive most readily illuminates the perspective of John Alcock, the master of the shop from which this object came. The object's idiosyncratic form suggests that Alcock may have invented it, with inspirations from British designs. The object's dimensions and storage organization are very similar to an auxiliary storage cabinet in Sheraton's ladies' dressing table, as you see illustrated on the left. The survival of 4 highly similar forms, however, suggests that these objects were not unique artisanal creations, but were rather efficiently made to popular demand and to maximize Alcock's profit. The misaligned ivory escutcheons, elementary inlay that certainly could have been made in shop rather than imported from somewhere else, and glue blocks, way too many glue blocks, applied for sort of quick stabilization, reveal not a sloppy craftsman, but rather a shrewd, efficient businessman. Time was money. Alcock was certainly aware of his very thin edge in a competitive world, where makers were serving increasingly overlapping clientele, as he advertised his mahogany furniture for, quote, sale at New York prices, or 10% lower than any made in Virginia in 1809. Each piece of these furniture sold helped him consolidate his wealth. He advertised for over $3,000 worth of inventory in 1807 and quite remarkably retired early in 1819. He did not die at the bench. Hooray. To Alcock, this object and many others like it paved his way to financial success and a leisurely retirement. But it's also important to acknowledge and remember that he was not the only maker of our object, nor was his acumen the sole reason for his thriving shop. In 1800, Fredericksburg had a population of 2,400 people, over half of whom were Black, and most of the Black community were enslaved. While we do not know how many Alcock enslaved and what their roles were without his inventory, he advertises consistently to buy and sell people throughout his career. In February 1798, the Spotsylvania County Order Book mentions, quote, Harry, an aged and infirm slave belonging to Alcock, end quote. In June of the same year, Alcock advertises that he will, quote, sell or exchange for a boy, a Negro woman, within the same breath as he hawks his, quote, quantity of Windsor chairs. Alcock's urgent need to enslave a young worker, likely to replace Harry's labor, suggests that Harry had perhaps passed. One must wonder if his infirmity, as noted in the records, reflects the damaging effects of the labor he performed under Alcock's enslavement. Alcock blithely parallels his trade of furniture with his exchange of worn-out bodies for fresh labor, highlighting that objects like ours were both contingent on and disturbingly conflated with trafficked, enslaved bodies. This trade not only ensured the efficient operation of Alcock's workshop, but also expanded and reinforced his cosmopolitan ties to other cabinet makers. In 1808, Alcock sold James, a man he enslaved, to Robert Walker, a Charleston cabinet maker. The very same year also saw the first time that Alcock advertised a large quantity of furniture hardware, the sort that Walker consistently advertises and sells in his workshop. Was James's human body exchanged for the crafted materials that hold up furniture carcasses? That James was sold from one cabinet maker to another further suggests that he might have been a skilled craftsman. Perhaps he had had a hand in the making of our object, or at least others like it. James turned up 2 years later in a runway ad, self-emancipating further south to Savannah, suggesting that he might have come from the deep south and may even have been trained there. Diverse crafting knowledge and materials traveled across regions, linked through enslaved bodies in motion. This object, our object, signaled mercantile prosperity and cosmopolitan connectivity to Alcock, but would have embodied something quite different: the trauma of forced migration and exploitative labor for its unnamed Black makers. What was the object for Robert and Frances Pendleton Taylor, the Orange, Virginia couple who bought and used it? Despite the lack of direct evidence that suggests female usage, the object's decoration and size parallel the delicate and portable women's writing furniture that grew in popularity throughout the long 18th century. Chippendale's 1754 furniture catalog marketed a lady's writing desk, a trend that certainly also continued with Sheraton's later designs. Considering the object's gendered use, however, illuminates a challenging although fascinating archival blind spot. While we know about the illustrious political career of Robert Taylor, who likely commissioned the object, we know decidedly less about his wife, Frances Pendleton Taylor, for whom this object was likely intended, why she owned the object, or how she would have understood it and made use of it. Mobilizing our senses, as Frances did, to engage with the same object can, nevertheless, illuminate aspects of its use. The object's small size implied mobility. The yellow pine backboard is pinked to match the mahogany sides, suggesting that it was meant to be seen from multiple angles and in motion. The object, however, showed a certain reluctance for longer journeys. Its bottom featured curved skirts on all three sides, making it quite difficult to get a secure hold to move it, as I found out the hard way. The glazed doors shattered easily in transport, the fragility also demonstrated by repairs to the top left mullion. All this goes to suggest that while the object likely did not travel far, it could certainly be moved from room to room, transforming idle surfaces into makeshift desks. Containing important papers and letters, the object might have served, if you will, as a pre-modern iPad, a more portable, albeit less capacious version of the early modern computer, and I'm talking about the desk and bookcase. The object's small storage, limiting its capacity to process data, echoes contemporary dismissals of female writing as trivial and less prolific than their male counterparts. The assumption that women simply had more stuff, abundantly illustrated by the gendering of things like wardrobes, linen presses, and corner cupboards, apparently simply did not apply when it comes to texts. Very intriguing. The compactness of female writing furniture has further implications on how much privacy women like Frances could expect over their possessions. Unlike a desk and bookcase, whose immovable bulk allowed concealed storage spaces for privacy, this object maintained merely a veneer of privacy. Can any cabinet that allows full view of its contents and is small enough to be easily carried off ever be considered truly secure? A cognate of the object shows a shattered mullion, further reminding us that the object only kept things safe under constant surveillance. Did the object's limited radius of mobility also parallel Frances's similarly circumscribed movement in her own domicile? Yet if our object implied Frances's domesticity, it also hints at ways that it enabled her to maintain and manage far-flung networks. The object's drawers and pigeonholes, too small and too short for books, are primed to sort and store letters from families and friends. While we don't know Frances's parents, we do know that she was from the powerful Pendleton family based in Caroline County, Virginia. The object's compartments served as ready memory places, or rather memory palaces, where Frances could store and restore letters that connected her remembrance of her Chesapeake family home with her married life in the Piedmont. The exchange of letters could have connected Frances to events even further afield. One of Frances's sons grew up to be an import merchant in Richmond. The Pendleton family, hailing from Lancashire in Britain, could have kept up transatlantic epistolary links for effective political or economic reasons, as is common in the time. Just as the object features Chinese-style mullions arriving in America via English design books, the object's interior also signals the possibility to access the Atlantic world from a Virginian boudoir. Frances, however, did not have exclusive access to the object that encases her most personal paper archive. The object is small, but pretty hefty. The bodies of enslaved servants, rather than the staid and corseted body of a planter's wife, lifted, transported, and stowed this object throughout the plantation house. It was, again, enslaved hands that maintained the veneer of gentility projected by the mahogany and gleaming glass. Indeed, this object likely spent more time in the hands of those who Frances enslaved than in her own. Physical proximity to this object also offers opportunities for the physical breach of its contents. The object's near intact condition does suggest that this possibility did not materialize. The glazed doors, nevertheless, would have enabled one to visually access and assess its contents with a single well-placed glance. Looking through the glazed doors, assuming the perspective of an enslaved servant, implies that this object, a site of cosmopolitan mastery for Frances, was also a potential site for those who she subjugated to contest that control. Finally, what should this object be to us? The caretakers who occupy, granted, a very different world from the object's birth. Our object's biography reveals that as things lead rich lives, our interpretations of those lives, as they should be, are mutable as well. Long interpreted as an example of Baltimorean refinement, this object now bears witness to the artistic innovation of Fredericksburg, which until recently had been considered too provincial for serious interrogation. Our object proves that, contrary to Joseph Downes's infamous statement in 1949, that things of artistic merit have always been made south of Baltimore, a proof that, thanks to the last 70 or so years of thoughtful scholarship, is in less and less need of immediate assertion. But this object, I would argue, also suggests that perhaps scholars of Southern material heritage ought not to be satisfied by simply proving Downes wrong. While studying cities like Baltimore, Norfolk, and Charleston have revealed vibrant centers of artistic creation that rivaled Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, large swathes of the so-called provincial South have remained, for the most part, absent from the study of Southern artistic merit. Yet our object's tidewater making and Piedmont consumption are intimately linked to events in Philadelphia, in Charleston, in Britain, and in the Caribbean through ties forged by cosmopolitan patrons, peripatetic makers, enslaved laborers, and ancient trees. The object illustrates just how much work we have to do to unite things through their many stories and histories, and hint at just how rewarding this work can be in expanding our understanding of the vast early South. I will now leave you all with a question that this object left me with. What is this object to you? Thank you so much.